Hey everyone, so I've got a really great guest today, and we're going to touch on all of the topics. I mean that. We're going to get into metaphysics, politics, religion, epistemology. We didn't have the greatest Zoom connection, but the audio is pretty reliable, so stay right there, all right? Hey good people, I'm Derek London. Thanks for checking out my channel. Around here we talk about everything law of attraction. We discuss a lot about the psychological, scientific, and rational basis for subscribing to this philosophy of mine. And in fact, if your reality could stand some change for the better, you have only to start there, with your mind. Hit that subscribe button and settle in, because your life will never be the same. Hey everyone, thanks as always for stopping by. Today, it's my pleasure to bring you Robert Bonomo. Robert is a fellow YouTuber who reached out to me because of my interview some time ago with Bernardo Castra. In his email, he attached a documentary I thought was really interesting. It's called Twilight of the Archons. Now, considering it only came out at the beginning of February, it's performing really well. I think it's got about 12,000 views so far, so kudos on that. Anyways, I wanted to focus on that work as there's a lot of overlap in what I speak about on my channel, being philosophy and law of attraction and personal development. All those things were brought up. I was hoping we could also expand on some of the topics and themes you also brought up therein. Thanks for being here, Robert. For those listening in, would you mind just giving a brief synopsis of the documentary?
Sure. What it does is it discusses a little bit the materialist paradigm that I would say generally most of the modern world is in right now. So it gives a small critique of that. And then it looks at two parts of it. One is money, which is obviously very important in modern life everywhere. And the other is consciousness. Mm-hmm. And it tries to show, it attempts to show that what we think about money really isn't quite what money is. And maybe consciousness also is something a little bit different than the current paradigm would like to believe.
It was amazing how you tied the two together, because lots of people don't draw that connection right away between the philosophy of materialism as it concerns consciousness, and then how there's all those other things that that abstract from that. I was also struck by just the amount of effort you put into the video. Like, how long did it take you to make the Twilight of the Archons?
So I began it in September 2018 after I had finished the previous documentary. Was called The 21 Faces of God, which was about the major arcana of the tarot, but not as a divination tool, as sort of a spiritual path. So I actually came up with this idea like in 2016 and had been thinking about it a lot. And in 2018, I began looking for clips, because what I do is I take clips from films, documentaries, and I put it together, create a voiceover. So it's based a little bit on Adam Curtis, the documentarian from the BBC. I really was influenced by him, but that way he just used the archives of the BBC. So he doesn't really create any footage himself. He uses footage from the BBC and then creates a voiceover. So I kind of based it a little bit on him. So it took me about 2.5 years.
Wow.
And the coronavirus really kind of threw me for a loop, because I started thinking, there's some things here. I've got to be able to incorporate this. And a lot of the upheaval, the political upheaval and such, the film's not political, but I had to kind of absorb all that and then continue. So I had a pause there during that, especially the first 4 or 5 months of the lockdown. But then once I got comfortable with all the ideas, I incorporated some of it, and I was able to finish it.
Well, I mean, you did a really good job of it. I mean, it's I don't know how you could turn that around even within the time that you did, because it was a lot of stuff in there, and it was really well worded. Lots of the lines you had were very pithy and thoughtful. I should just mention before we continue that for those of you listening in, there's a little bit of a slight delay here. It's only just because he's all the way over in Tunisia and I'm over here in Canada. So we got a little bit of a delay there, but I think we'll still have a good conversation. The title that you came up with, The Twilight of the Archons, do you want to explain? You mentioned that it's from the tarot there, not divination or anything, but maybe just go into a little bit of the mythology behind the archons there, if you don't mind.
Sure. So the archons really come from the Gnostic cosmology. And what the archons are the rulers of this dimension, this world that we live in. Now, this is mythological language. It shouldn't be taken literally. And I don't believe even the Gnostics took this literally. One simple way to think about it is if you think about astrology as the different planetary rulers. So, for example, the moon, Mars, Venus, these would be gods that rule certain planes. So in the Gnostic cosmology, if you think of the zodiac here and then the planets and then the earth, a spirit goes through the zodiac, down through the planets, and lands on earth. And then when it leaves, it goes up through the planets. So for example, the first planet it reaches is Saturn, which in Greek is Chronos. So the soul is put into time. That's the first archon. And then you have, say, Jupiter, which is law, philosophy, goddess. In a sense, Jupiter is Zeus pater. So it's sort of the laws, even like the laws of culture, even of physics, maybe, of this world that we live in, what confines us. And the Gnostics were kind of negative about this world. So they saw them as negative rulers. And they used the Greek idea of the demiurge. So the God, say, of the Bible might not be, it could be a neutral figure towards negative. And then there's a God beyond God. That's where Sophia comes and Jesus comes and everything. It's a very different cosmology. So the archons would be the rulers of this world.
And it's a very apt illustration for the materialist paradigm. When I saw Twilight of the Archons, the title and some of the mythic illustrations therein, I totally saw where you were going with that. And I think a lot of people do a disservice to kind of our ancient religions and stuff like that when they look at these, crazy goblins and creatures, and we think, oh, they actually believed in this stuff, and maybe some of them did. I mean, yeah, we got some fundamental religionists in our time too, but they represented something, and that you couldn't have found a more fitting illustration for materialism, could you?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think we have to be careful not to confuse this with actually believing that there's, it's a mythology, but it's a living mythology.
Yeah, sure it is. Okay, so clearly, I mean, you already mentioned that, it's an indictment on the materialist paradigms, which dominates our modern psyche. And obviously, we have a huge commonality there on our channels. Something that I thought was really neat was how dystopian our materialist culture is when taken with zero skepticism. You really draw that out. And yet, despite the work's darker elements, I actually consider the message to be rather positive. What do you hope to accomplish with this film? What would be the best possible scenario that you would like to see for this film?
Right. And I can see how maybe the first half of the film can be kind of negative. Because, like you say, it's sort of, it really is sort of this dystopian worldview of the machine that rules us. But in the end, what I try and do is show that if the fundamental question in the film is, are we in our bodies, or are our bodies in us? So if we are this unified consciousness, when we, for example, feel love, what we feel is the unity of our oneness. And that love underlies everything. And so sometimes I think you can make the case that the materialist paradigm misses that. And it misses consciousness entirely. Well, not entirely, but in a strong sense, it misses consciousness. By missing consciousness, you miss that unified field, which is love, really. That's what it is. It's that bliss. And so there is a way to get there, but you can't get there looking for it out there, because it's not going to happen.
I'd really like to repeat one of the lines you brought up near the beginning. This is really well written, how you brought it out. You said, we're socially engineered through political drama, advertising, and big data. At the same time, traditional religion has lost its grip on much of the world as its fundamental myths have lost touch with modern cosmologies. Mainstream religion no longer serves the purpose of explaining the world, and it has lost the ability to connect modern people to their modern selves. I'm bungling this up, sorry, to their transcendent selves, unquote. Now, I like how you worded that. Most people would consider the decline of organized religion to be a positive development. Why do you think, though, that science couldn't perform the same role in reconnecting ourselves with the transcendent element of our being?
Because science is missing one fundamental thing, which is meaning. So I'm not at all anti-science. I love science. I think it's
Yeah.
fascinating. I just want to make that clear. But in science, there's no meaning. I remember once there was a I think it was in Reddit or somewhere. There was an astrophysicist who was on an astrology Reddit. And he said, I love you astrologers because what you do is you give what we do meaning.
Yeah.
We come up with these fabulously beautiful theories. Math is fabulous, it's wonderful, but it doesn't really mean anything. And so, I mean, if you think about, in Platonic thought, there was the trivium and the quadrivium of, it's fascinating to think about. This is how they taught math. They taught math, then math in space was geometry, math in time was music, and math or number in space and time was astrology. and then you had the trivium, which is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. But at that time, the planets had meaning. They meant something. And if you look, I would say sometime around Galileo, that changes. You get to Newton, then it's this clock. It's just a clock that God created, but no meaning inside the clock. Before that, everything had some sort of significance. And since we've lost that, modern religion, I think it has lost, and Campbell mentions this very clearly in the film, a modern mythology has to include a cosmology that connects with science. If there's a conflict there, we have a problem, because people are going to say, wait a second, how could X, Y, Z happen if it goes against the laws of physics? You need a cosmology that fits with the laws of physics. And that's the problem for modern religion. It's a serious problem.
Oh, yeah, big time. And what you explained there, though, do you think that that's partially responsible for why religions kind of modify their interpretation, or sometimes the image that was set up as their mythology? Do you think that's responsible for that to some degree?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, at some point, I never forget as a kid, my father said something I never quite understood. I asked him one of those weird, bizarre kid questions, and my father looked at me and he said, I was raised Catholic, a Catholic family. And my father said, he said, well, if the Martians come down tomorrow, what do you think the Catholic Church is going to do?
Yeah.
And he just left it. He left the question there. And I think what he was saying was they would have to include this. They would have to create a cosmology around Martians landing on, the lawn of the White House and getting down and shaking hands with, Jimmy Carter or whoever was the president. But you know what I mean? You have to evolve. And the problem that we have a major problem, is that people take mythology and they convert it into history. Mythology is not history. It's something else. It's a story that points to a truth, but it's not history. But if you take mythology and you confuse it with history, and I'll say something else which is very important. A lot of people confuse the other way around. They take history and they turn it into mythology to give it meaning, which is another mistake that can be very dangerous.
Yeah,
so you have
sure.
this confusion of mythology and history. And I think, who was it? I think it was William James who said, religion is often believing in somebody else's spiritual experience.
Yeah.
That's a real problem with religion, that a lot of times modern religion doesn't give you that transcendent experience. It's a belief in something else. But for example, Western religions say, well, if you make that leap of faith, you get a God that will fix everything. Eastern religions say, I exist, But the problem is, what about everything else?
Yes.
Does everything else exist? But you get that, you know.
I didn't realize that you were raised as a Catholic. I've had this question sort of in the back of my mind as I was writing out the script here. That part that you mentioned, let me find it again. It said, at the same time, traditional religion has lost its grip on much of the world as its fundamental myths have lost touch with modern cosmologies. Now, you would be aware of how the Catholic Church, while there are certainly many examples where they haven't kept up with modern cosmologies, on the other hand, there are examples like the famed Belgian bishop, Georges Lemaitre, who proposed the Big Bang Theory and based on the Hubble law. So like how do you explain that disconnect? I mean, here's a guy, he wasn't like spiritual weak according to the Catholics, he was exemplary, and yet he was up on his science. How do you rectify those two kind of inconsistencies?
It's absolutely fascinating that when you look into the Big Bang Theory, it comes from a Catholic theologian, because it makes perfect sense. God created the world. You remember Terence McKenna?
Yep.
Yeah, he used to say that. He goes, modern science, but you got to take a couple hard gulps, because the universe was created out of nothing for no reason in an instant. And if you buy that, then the Big Bang works great. And I'm not saying anything wrong with the Big Bang. I'm not a physicist.
Right,
but
right.
McKenna's point was, yeah, we get back to there, great, but then what? What? And it's why it's almost a religious myth thing. And I saw once something that's fascinating. I put this in my other documentary. It was one of the theories of the theory of supersymmetry. If you look at the supersymmetry model and you know anything about astrology, it looks just like the zodiac. It's unbelievable. It's like that same archetype. And it's fascinating. Like if you took a Jungian would look at that and say, of course, what we're doing is we're taking these archetypes, number archetypes, and putting these theories into these archetypes of number. That intersection of math and physics is very interesting, because a lot of physics first comes the math, then you get the physics. And where are the numbers? That's a whole different discussion for mathematicians, but where do they exist? Do they actually exist, or did we create them? And if you say you discovered them, then you're discovering an archetype, and that archetype seeps into the Big Bang, supersymmetry, etc. You see what I mean?
And to many people, like certainly the Lawrence Krauss types might say math, archetype, there's no connection there. And yet there's a huge connection, because numbers are implicitly symbolic. They're semiotic. They are of a, what do you call that? They're already of a metaphoric nature. What about this little squiggle two correlates with two apples or to anything, that you take? There's no connection there. So it is implicitly metaphoric, right?
I mean, absolutely, because you could ask one of those people, because there are different schools. There are schools that number is something that's created, and then there's the Platonic school, basically, which is numbers exist and we discover them. They're embedded in the laws of physics. And I think if in mathematical circles you get more of the Platonic view, and in physics circles you get more of the invented view. But you could ask somebody, well, where does a circle exist in nature? Can you find me one?
Yeah.
And of course they would say, no, there are no circles in nature. There are things that are close to circles, but no circle. So what about pi? Can you find pi in the forest? Go find me pi. Does pi work? Look at all the basic physics equations. You see pi in there. So where does that come from? That's a creation of ours that happens to be so accurate. Musical harmony. Why does musical harmony coincide with whole fractions? Like a perfect fifth would be, you see what I mean? It's not, 19 over 29 is perfect harmony. No, it's 3/4, it's 1/2, 3/4. You see what I mean? There's a very strange connection between number and the material world. In music, you see that in harmony. And when you bring up that argument, I mean, that's the whole Pythagorean thing, that Pythagoras said, oh my God, these numbers actually are equivalent to sound, but harmony and sound. This is amazing. It's still amazing. Why don't we teach kids that? I have no idea. If you taught kids that about numbers, they would be like, this is magic. And it is. It is magic. Amazing.
That's exactly what it is. I mean, I'm something of a musician myself, and perhaps one of the most profound things that I discovered was, okay, so everyone's taught the circle of fifths, how you can get to every chromatic number within any scale by just bouncing fifths apart, and eventually you'll hit all of them. Well, what blew me away is I was doodling around on the guitar and I started counting that number descendingly. I went backwards, and now you've got a circle of fourths. And I was like, what the heck? That blew my mind. I mean, that's still fairly elementary musical theory, but I kind of discovered it myself. No one had taught me that. And I was like, man, this is spooky stuff, just how math works like that. Now, getting into kind of archetypes, what you mentioned, but applying it more towards cultures and communities. Why do you think cultural archetypes and assumptions, mythologies are important for human psyches?
Because if we think of mythologies as sort of the operating systems of our cultures need operating systems. And what are those operating systems? They're simply the beliefs, things that we believe, that stories that work well for us as a society. And for example, countries, I mean, some people might be more or less like, but countries are simply a story. It's an abstraction. There's no place where Canada ends, and you can't, like, there's no line in the universe. When I jump over that line, all of a sudden something happens. No, it's an arbitrary, it's a story, the Canadian story, the American story. And we have lots of myths about law, about money, about many things. And these stories work for us. They give us social order.
Yeah.
And as our societies become more complex, we need more complex stories. Now, sometimes those stories go south, and we've seen that in history. No need to go into them, but we all know the certain stories where the story gets twisted and we get horrible histories, right? So that's why archetypes are so important, because where do those stories come from? And this is the work of not just of Campbell, of all of these people that see there are certain structures, archetypes within all of these stories, all of them. Some of the stories point to are the transcendent part of man. Some of them are just social order. Some of them teach you the pedagogical sort of stories of how to live, right? So they have different functions, the stories. But that's why those archetypes are so important, because they underlie all of our stories, and our stories run the world. Remember, the reality of our stories is much more important than the reality of the physical world, much more. So just for modern people.
Well, we think in our scientific age that science has kind of stripped us of our need for story, and yet materialism, you bring out in the documentary that materialism is nothing but an archetype in itself, and this is why we need to have contrasting mythologies to kind of bring out each other's frailties, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think if you poke around physics with an open mind, you're going to see a lot of stories, a lot of archetypes.
Oh, yeah.
If you poke around history, sociology, all of these things, what you get are these archetypical stories that people impose. And the problem is a lot of people think, oh, it's science. Well, it's sort of science. When we start putting these archetypes in, can we ever escape these stories? This is the question. Can we escape them? I would say we can't. It's impossible. Why? Because we never encounter this physical world. I put that clip in from Max Planck into the documentary, where Planck says, one of the fathers of quantum mechanics.
Oh, yeah.
He said very interesting. If you really pay attention to what he said, you can never get behind consciousness. Can never get behind it. You're always in it. And we cannot escape it. I was talking to somebody the other day. I was on some sort of YouTube thing, and the guy was a bit antagonistic. So,
really?
I asked him, well, have you ever observed consciousness? So, no, but I've observed parts of it. Well, can you observe it in a lizard, in a mouse, And what you observe of the consciousness in that mouse, you observe from within your own consciousness. You can never get outside it. So we're stuck in this. So when we encounter a bird, a tree, where is that tree? It's in our minds. We never encounter the tree. Now, this is neurology. This is not some, this is basic science. The green in the tree is in your mind. What is that tree exactly? Go down, go down, go down, go down. Ask a physicist. What is it? It's an intersection of fields, is what it is. And what is that? And what's under that? It can get, But the tree we see in our mind that we encounter is here.
Yeah, very much so. And that's the one of the biggest intractable problems in philosophy that I've found. The philosophical works, I think Thomas Nagel, I know I always fangirl after him, but he has drawn that out better than anyone, I think, is just how there's you can't seem to get behind consciousness, even when you so I'm going to go into a little bit of a rant here. I hope that's okay. The problem with the materialist worldview is that it takes externality as kind of a fundamental explainer of what's going on in the world. And so the temptation then is to turn that back on yourself and say, let's explain the organism's interaction with truth. And so that's how you get psychology and behaviorism and sociology. But the moment you do that, those are always viewed within a lens, a presupposition of psychology, sociology, and behaviorism. And so you're trying to get behind consciousness and you just simply can't. It's so intractable. And that's why he called his book The View from Nowhere. That's how you end up with this centralist view. It's so disorienting. You bring up Joseph Campbell.
Paper on bats. He had that famous paper on bats, right?
That's right.
The life of a. I remember when I read that, it had a very powerful effect on me. I mean, it really hit me. I was like, I think that paper was the first time I actually began to think about this and said,
yeah,
wait a second. It was like,
well, that was a breaking paper for its time. That was back in the 70s, I think, and that put him on the map, man, because that was a heavy hitter. Like you read that, trust me, you go into more Thomas Nagel and he'll turn your brain into goo. It's nuts. But something I was going to mention is you brought up Joseph Campbell. Yeah. He mentions how mythologies spring from within communities. I mean, we talked about how that even emerges within materialism. But he mentioned something in there. He explained why we can't seem to find an image or a story to unite all of the communities. Now, do you think such a reality could develop? Do you think that perhaps becoming an interplanetary species or some of the more strident materialist goals of, say, Elon Musk or Bill Gates could accomplish that? Do you think that's possible?
I personally think it's very possible. Yeah. Because look how modern mythologies let's take, for example, the European Union. 50 years ago, the European Union was the dream of a few technocrats. Now there's a whole mythology around that. What it means to be, I lived in Spain when Spain entered the EU officially, and then when we integrated the euro, and it was a powerful story. It was a mythological story of this greater Europe and what it represented, what it meant, etc. So mythologies evolve. Mm-hmm. Look at the Soviet Union. If you go to the Soviet Union, Russia now, you'll see a lot of the mythology comes from the communist era still. So yes, you can create new mythologies. However, what you can't do, I used to work in marketing. It's like brands. Good brands are not created, they emerge. Huh. Google popped up, but you can't say, oh, I want to make a brand. Ask anybody in marketing. If you say, I want to compete with Colgate, you spend a ton of money, you advertise, people will buy your brand, Bob Gate toothpaste. But as soon as you stop advertising, people stop buying because there's no brand. There's no brand there. I use Colgate because my mother bought Colgate, and that connection You can't create it, it just emerges. That's why brands are so valuable. Myths are like brands.
Hmm.
Take a great brand like, I don't know, like a Chanel. That feeling when you see Chanel, it's like exclusive, quality. It has that. You can't make that. And mythologies are like that. And when you mentioned Musk, Musk is a guy who's just mythology is just coming out of his ears.
Oh yeah.
I hear him talk. And the thing is, because he's not consciously trying to create a story, he just kind of, the stuff, it just kind of flies out of him. Around him, I could see some very, very interesting mythologies emerge. Kurzweil, on the other hand, I think is trying a little too hard to create this whole singularity mythology. People, but it's still powerful and it still works. And a lot of people buy into that. The simulation theory is another one that was very interesting. So I think, yes, a global mythology will emerge, and you see it emerging in certain, like the Olympics, for example,
Yeah.
have that quality of a global community, etc. The World Cup, these kind of things. I mean, it's going to take time, but what we're missing is that underlying kind of tale. And that's why I think something about the UFO story, something about that is going to wind up giving us a collective common identity. That's what I know it sounds kooky, but it needs to be something kooky because it's got to capture all of our imaginations.
Yeah. How do you think it would accomplish that? Just elaborate on that. That's an interesting idea.
Because you said intergalactic, our identities were based on ethnic groups. For example, humans lived for the vast majority of our 200,000 years in groups of like 50 to 150. And this has been studied pretty well. They study people's name associations and things. So the groups were small. So the stories needed to control a small group of people in a small area. Oh, I don't know, 10, 20 square miles. No? But now we have to get a story that unifies all of us as Earth in a solar system, in a galaxy, right? What could do that? Contact with something beyond us would all of a sudden unite us because remember, there's always a them. There's got to be a them. So it would be us and them. And that's where I see the UFO story coming in as part of this mythology. How, I don't know, but I can feel it. And it's interesting in the last couple of years, since December 2018, remember the New York Times came out with those UFO articles, sort of mainstreamed the UFO world. I started to smell a rat here, going, this sounds like there's something going on. But it's mythologically more important than it is the actual Martians themselves, I think.
I mean, you kind of had a little bit of that in the space race, right?
Yeah.
Getting to the moon first was more about what it's going to do for us as a people, what it's going to do for our collective kind of image of ourselves. There was nothing there in itself going to the moon that was profitable or I don't know the word for it, but you know what I'm saying, right?
But seeing the Earth from that perspective united the world in a sense.
Sure.
In the last section of my film, if you pay attention, the music I use is from First Man, the music when they're landing on the moon. I did that on purpose because that music has that sort of where you reach someplace beyond where you get a different perspective.
Wow, that's a whole other layer, man. You're playing chess and I'm down here playing checkers. I didn't pick up on that. You put a lot of work into it. That's very thoughtful. So I'm with you on how the idea of how materialism can be soul deadening and even responsible for much of the destruction we see in terms of corporatism, consumerism, and perhaps most notably scientism. However, an argument that often figures prominently in debates, religious debates and political debates, is whether you can really blame an entire philosophy for its political outworkings. Take any philosophy, you're going to find some group or party that has totally corrupted it. Christianity is a good example of that, right? Most people struggle to find much beyond the concept of propitiation, say, wrong with Christianity. Like most people love their Edwards. in the Bible. So I guess my question is, on what basis do we have to reject materialism, or should we even abandon it entirely?
Well, it's interesting from an idealistic philosophy. If you look at idealism
Yeah.
as the world as entirely, basically, in the mind, no, to simplify it, pure materialism is actually the same thing.
Yeah.
But how many materialists are actually pure materialists? Because they say, well, there's material, or then there's this thing called consciousness, it's an epiphenomenon of the brain. Yeah, but is it in the, and then they get a little gooey wooey. If they stuck entirely to materialism, they would actually be non-dualists. It'd be the same thing, almost, which is an interesting point. No?
Well, it's a very good point. And I think Bernardo Kastrup kind of brought that out in the conversation I had with him, is he says it's not idealists necessarily who assert that everything is solipsism. Although Bernardo Kastrup would say that we don't exist within our own minds necessarily. We exist within mind at large. That's his position. Which is somewhat, there's variance on that in the idealistic community. But what he mentioned about the materialists, he says, you end up in a solipsism when you take the materialist view, because you're saying that all of this is happening in here, that the stars I see don't really correlate with anything out there. It's all just a form of, it's just synaptic connections and perception and all
TV
of it.
in the brain.
Yeah. And so that's when he said that, I was like, yeah, I mean, that's really troubling, because even I, as critical as I am towards materialism, I still can't sort of get out of that headspace just because of the culture we live in. Do you find that, by the way, do you find it hard to extricate yourself from the materialist psyche?
Incredibly difficult. And as I'm a teacher, I'm a lecturer at a university, so when I try, and these ideas have to be careful, but when you kind of throw them in there, when you say, when you see that chair, what are you exactly seeing? Our education system does a very poor job of explaining how we interact with the world. So it takes so much as you get older. Nietzsche used to talk about this. Remember all the beliefs that we had to get rid of all those beliefs. And it's so true. The older you get, you realize how much baggage we have.
Oh, yeah.
I constantly find beliefs. I'm like, why do I believe that? Do I have a rational reason to believe that? Is it really truly rational? Is it helping me? Why do I want this story? Yes, but I'm not an anti-materialist in the sense of it was a stage of history we had to go through. And look at what we've discovered. I mean, I think it's actually mind-boggling. I love science. I love empirical thinking. I mean, there's parts of empiricism are fabulous. It's not something we need to discard, but what we have to do is create a mythology where that empirical view gives us meaning. If it gives us meaning and it makes us happy and it works, it's much more important than if it's true. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing, because that worldview is and I think you can't argue with its achievements. But is it enough to live? I can't live off Nike, social justice. Social justice is great. It is great. And there's nothing wrong with it. But the problem is, what happens, because I often talk to people, they say, well, what about if we make the meaning of life making the world a better place? Mm-hmm. And I often say, okay, I give you the magic wand. Here's the magic wand. Pass the magic wand and make all the changes you think necessary that are legitimate. There's nothing wrong with that, but you change everything. Then what? Then you can sit back, and then that's from your point of view. In 100 years, I mean, think about what we eat. Do you really think in 1,000 years we're going to eat animals? I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
I kind of doubt it. I think everything, people will look back on the way we treat animals and think, what barbarians. But we were, at least I was raised in a family, you eat meat, and that it was just entirely normal. It was nothing we even thought about. So in this evolution of what is just, what is moral, if you really look, there is no morality in the universe. That's nonsense. There's no good or bad. It's all relative. So relative to now, you pass that magic wand, you make the world correct as you see it. It still doesn't give you meaning. Meaning is it's something. There's a transcendent part to man in all of our mythologies, and we need that. And that doesn't come from us; it comes from nature. Study human culture. Why do all cultures have this? And people say, "Oh, well, people don't need stories to survive." Look at people today. People do fine. I mean, they survive quite well into their 80s without any kind of transcendent mythology. They don't need it, but it's, as a culture, it's something that enriches us and gives us that, you know what I mean? It's that being in it, that bliss, that creation. That's what we all long for. We long for that happiness. And out there, we just get frustration, especially in the second half of life. I think in the second half of life, the first half of life, I think a career, relationships, whatever, those things, most culture is made for people under 40. It really is.
I never thought of that.
Oh, yeah. McKenna talked about that too, that, McKenna, I like McKenna. I know that he said a lot of crazy stuff, but there's one thing McKenna said that I found was brilliant. He was about 45. He went to get a checkup. The doctor said, "You're all right." And the doctor said, "You should be lucky because 100 years ago, most guys your age were dead." And McKenna, it hit him. He said, most culture is made for people under 40. Once you get over 40 into your 50s, these stories don't work anymore. They stop feeding your soul. It's like, yeah, for the first half of life, yeah, I need stories that will get me through relationships, my career, how to interact with, with people in my community. But you need something else when you get older, and there's no myths there's no stories. And so you're kind of in lost territory. And that's where the film goes, says, at that point in life, that's kind of the time to point in.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you'll find it. You'll get those insights, and you go, ah. And then there's that journey in. It's kind of the journey out. The prodigal son, he goes out, screws around, has fun. Then he realizes, I was living better at home. And that's the journey back home. And remember the father, he kills the fatted calf. You know what I mean? That's that whole story coming back to you.
Do you think that this basically that conclusion at the end of your documentary could become a mythology in itself, or do you think you've bottomed out?
You mean when I talk about bliss?
No, I guess that enters into it. I mean, the conclusion at the end where basically the only way out is in, being that we're basically creating our own narratives. Do you think that could become an image, so to speak, in itself? Is that possible?
Oh, I think it actually has to be. It has to be, because it's the only way. But the stories have to, there are stories there that point us to that direction. But it's the only way, because you're never going to find it out there. You can find, it's not going to be in a church, in a guru, in a book, in a beautiful place, in a lot of money, and it's a difficult journey. It's a terrifying journey.
Yeah.
But that journey back is where you find the true meaning, because consciousness has no qualities, right? There's no colors, or that's where it is. So it's out and then back in. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said, I mean, if you think about it, is you pop into the world and you're driving a car and you forget that you're part of the car. You think, I'm part of this car. I'm part of the Cadillac. But then you realize, wait, maybe I'm not. And you let go of the steering wheel and the car keeps driving. And you're like, whoa, I'm not part of this car. That's kind of the.
Well, yeah, that's kind of the funny, I don't know if I want to call it a duality, but that's what I'm going to go with for now is you reach this conclusion where everything is happening within mind or your interpretation of the world, whether or not consciousness emerges and is epiphenomenal. I mean, we can even leave that aside as a question for now. But even if that's the case. You still are bottom out in consciousness being fundamental. And just to mention that is an objectification of consciousness. So you've kind of already made a story out of it in a way. So the fact that we're condemned to our stories is not necessarily always bad. You know, maybe I'm maybe I'm getting carried away on this, but I find that you bring up a lot of interesting things here. This is really neat. You brought up money a second ago. Something else in the documentary, you spent a lot of time on that actually, is the monetary system of which we all play a role. Now, I'm not an economist, but I have researched a lot about what money fundamentally is, because that's a philosophical question. And you hit the nail on the head about how money is actually created. Can you explain the process of how money literally comes from a void of utter debt?
Right. And that's how, deposits are created. So it's very simple. When I teach this to my students, I always say, if I go to the supermarket and I buy, a cartload of food, and when I go to pay, I take out a piece of paper and I say, I owe you. And I sign Robert and I give it to the girl at the checkout. She's going to say, I'm sure you're a nice guy. I'm sure you will pay it back, but can you give me the cash, please?
Yeah.
So she's not going to take my IOU. So what do? I go to a bank and I give them the IOU. And they say, okay, Robert, I'll monetize this for you. So I'll take this IOU and I'll create a ledger. And it says, so I'm gonna buy this from you for $100. It has little marks on it. That's how money's created. So when a loan is created, that's how a deposit is created. Deposits are created, right? When a loan is created. And then as I pay that back, I pay back that $100, right? The money disappears. It's gone. So it's created and it's eliminated.
Yeah.
And that's how money's created. Most people don't understand that. Most people think when you go to a bank, what the bank loans me is what you deposited. So you deposit $100 and they pay you 1% and they lend it to me, at 10%. That's not what they're doing. So a deposit isn't a deposit. It's a loan to the bank. You're just loaning the bank money.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the opposite operation. They sign the promissory note. They give it to you and they take your money, right? It's a loan. And the opposite, when you borrow money, the bank creates the money, right, out of nothing, puts it in an account in exchange for your promissory note. That's all it is. And I'm not saying it's evil or anything.
No.
It can work. And Professor Warner talks about the example of Germany, how in Germany, banking has been a really major part of the German sort of economic progress. But what happens is, and the problem with it is one, we don't understand it. Most people don't understand banking. So when you go to a bank and you see they pay me 1% and they charge me 5%, well, that seems reasonable. But that's not how banking works. Most people think that's how it works. I worked in a bank. This is how I found this out. I worked in marketing for a bank. I did the direct marketing. I remember thinking, we're not making any money. And it ate at me until I figured it out. And then when I figured it out, I never forget, my wife was writing her thesis and I had this article in my head and I said, I'm afraid to write this because it sounds crazy. I wrote an article like in 2010 about this. I finally wrote the article and I published it. Wait, somebody's going to tell me I'm wrong. And then I remember a pretty important journalist wrote me a letter and he said, great article. There was one thing about a number. He said, are you sure about that number? And this guy, he's like, I'm right. It's not, I'm saying I invented it, but when I came to the understanding of what money was, it scared me. I thought people are gonna think I'm nuts. Now everybody accepts this. There's a part in the film for the Bank of England. That's why I made a point of saying, if there are any doubts, here's the Bank of England, and they explain it.
Yeah.
And I was having lunch with somebody from a central bank. Somebody I knew. And I remember it was so funny. We were talking. She goes, yeah, most people don't get that, do they? It was like, so this is real. The point in the film is, our materials world, a lot of it, we really don't understand. We don't understand money. We don't understand consciousness at all as a culture. If we understood these things, I think it would change our perspective a little bit on how we see the world.
Very much so. Very much so. And I couldn't help but draw the analog between how money is created and kind of the same philosophical questions that come from where does the universe originate. It's kind of the same question. So for example, there's always that argument which figures prominently at the beginning of all these type of topics, and that is there's no such thing as a free lunch, the free lunch argument. And cosmological models have demonstrated how the universe may have emerged in that exact same way, and this is actually where there's some consensus between materialists and idealists. They both assert that everything emerged from a void. It's just that idealists feel it emerged from a mental nothing, whereas materialists accept that it basically came from a point, that expanded outwards. I think that's Lawrence Krauss's
Like the
main.
Lawrence Krauss idea, of something
Yeah,
from nothing that.
yeah. Otherwise, you end up in another similarity of materialism and idealism, because now you get into more contingent type arguments. So, for example, traditional religious answers would say that God is the ground of being. They kind of stay waffly on whether how physical it could be, and the counterpart to that on atheism or materialism would be an eternal universe. And so, but you're still back at the free lunch question, aren't you? Either way you look at it. So, yeah, do you think that that every time you get back to that free lunch question, whether you're talking about money or whether you're talking about cosmology, uh, do you think that the problem is necessarily nihilistic or fatalistic in any sense? Or do you think it's okay that money and maybe even the whole world comes from nothing?
I think we have to, when we get to these questions, we have to realize that these questions are beyond the mind.
Yeah, just a little, hey?
Islam makes a point of saying that God is beyond logic.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. That he's not confined by logic. And when you get into some of those Sufi texts, it's beautiful, no? That everything is God and there's only God. It's so similar to Vedanta. It's sometimes Sufi texts, and you look at the Vedantic text, and you're like, whoa, it's extraordinary. But we have to. Now, I was listening to a lecture by Alan Watts today. I love Alan Watts.
Oh, me too. I'm a big fan.
So articulate. God, his English is beautiful.
He is incredible.
And he was talking about how this point is so interesting that, did you ever read Art and the Art of Archery?
Never read that one. No.
Zen book about archery. And the thing in archery is you have to let go as soon as you think. It's the same with shooting. Like if I think I'm going to shoot that target, it's too late. It has to all happen at the same time, the release and the thought. And it's so difficult to do that it frustrates you to such a point that you give up. And when you give up, you do it. A lot of us have that experience when you're trying to do something like with music. I bet there are some things you're like, I'm never going to do this. And then all of a sudden it happens.
Yep.
That I think is it can be very frustrating, but those insights happen at the moment of total frustration when you're completely stuck. There's another great book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So beautiful.
I've been wanting to get around to that one.
It's a fabulous book, and it's very Platonic. He talks a lot of, if you like philosophy, it's much more philosophical book than a Zen book. But the one Zen insight is the most creative moment. He uses the example, it's great too. If you ever worked on stuff, is when you strip a bolt, have you ever stripped it and there's no way to get a grip on it? And you're just like, you try everything and it's like, you've asked everyone, you've tried everything. And then for some reason, the insight comes there because it's actually beyond, I don't want to say this, it's beyond any way you've ever thought before. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah.
It's a totally new insight. That's a creative moment. And that's what happens with these questions. When you really, really, really crush it, you're stuck. Then the insight comes.
And that ties back quite well into what we were talking about money. And you had also mentioned giving somebody a wand when you were talking more about social activism. Just to, okay, you have a vision for what's better for the world, execute it. Now, applying that to money, do you feel that there could be a system that is not so financially unfair, such as the monetary one we're familiar with now?
I think we could use the current monetary system basically as it is and incorporate, for example, some elements of modern monetary theory to make, for example, a little bit more just society. I'm not saying we're going to reach any kind of nirvana. And just one simple fact that MMT points to, which is true. Most people think that what governments do is collect taxes,
Mm-hmm.
collect the taxes, and then they spend those taxes. And if they don't have enough money, they borrow money. That's not what governments do. In MMT, this is just economic monetary theory. Is they create the money, they spend it, and then taxation and debt is there to stabilize monetary policy, inflation, interest rates, etc. So, for example, during the coronavirus, it made a lot of sense to send people lots of money. And this money never has to be paid back. We have this idea that money has to be paid back. It doesn't have to be paid back, especially if our economy is operating at, say, 60% capacity, and
Right.
we're used to it functioning at 80% capacity. We can create money. That money can be used to consume things that are being produced. And we don't have to worry about that money. There's no inflation there. The problem is with these ideas is one, corruption. There's a lot of possibility for corruption. People just creating money and giving it to themselves. And the inflation part. Because yes, think about an apple orchard. If half of the apples aren't being picked, it's okay to create money to pay people to go pick the apples. The problem is, if all being picked, then you create money, then all you're doing is increasing the price of the apple.
Yeah.
Right. So if we have people, that's why you remember Bernie Sanders' whole idea of a guaranteed job program.
No, I don't remember that one.
Yeah, Bernie Sanders had this idea, and I think Biden is talking about it. I'm not sure. And I don't mean to get political, but I just mean the idea there was, if you have a certain group of people, especially men in modern society, like North America, a lot of men that drop out of the workforce, it makes sense to create money, give them jobs, to make them get up in the morning and get trained. Because when men stop getting up and getting in the rhythm of work, a lot of times they never get back in it. So it's worth it. When the economy is weak, you create a job guarantee, you give them jobs, just create jobs. It gets them up and gets them trained. And then as the economy begins to heat up, then you can send them back into the private sector and you reduce that whole job guarantee. You see what I mean? These types of programs, and I'm a big believer in money. For me is work. It's stored work.
Mm.
So I use the example of gold, right? If I'm going to sell you gold and we meet and you give me the money and you say, where's the gold? And I point to a mountain. I say, well, there's a lot of gold in that mountain. Go get it. You're going to say, hey, no, that's not the deal. The work, going to the mountain, digging out the gold, getting it, minting it, that's what the value that's stored in money. Money is work. But for example, we don't recognize motherhood as work. We don't, as a society, and we should.
Yeah, well, it's probably one of the greatest economic roles that's played in our system.
And a child is an asset. It really is, because you take a baby from a baby to a 22-year-old that has some sort of skills, that's socialized, knows language, etc. There's a value there. So you can create a certain amount of money, and on the other side of the ledger, you have this child. There you go. These things could help us. They're not revolutionary. We don't have to, cause a revolution. We get certain changes that increase the quality of people's lives without a UBI. Because a UBI, we get back to that point of something out of nothing. Can you really just take money and give it to somebody and say, yeah, there's something in me that says, but for example, people who help neighbors. Imagine certain folks in the neighborhood, disabled folks, older folks, they need help. You got young guys, young kids, you need a job. Go help your neighbors, and we'll create a certain amount of money and pay you to do a blockchain system to validate.
Oh, are you there? Oh, no. Hey, there you are. I lost you for about 20, 30 seconds. Sorry,
Where
Rob.
did you lose me? Do you remember where?
I think you were talking, well, you said something about universal basic income, and then you were talking about how, because that gets you back to your something from nothing scenario, but you said there might be some solution for people to help seniors and so on, and not be,
Yeah.
it sounded like you're saying socialize that aspect, you could have that come down from the
Sure.
government in some form of payment, and then that's about where I lost you.
Right, because in there, you're actually creating a certain amount of value. People's lives are being improved. I don't know, you paint somebody's house, so you say somebody's disabled or something, or there's some value that's created, so you can create money to do that. And I think there's a possibility with a blockchain system to validate that it's real, because what you have to always have the problem of corruption. But if it was validated, so maybe in the beginning you get paid very little, but as people validate your work, then it increases, and then you become sort of a valued member of the community because you help a lot of people, and you can pay people to do things like that. But
Yeah.
I think it's important that we pay people to do work, but just giving people money, like you said, there's something about that it just doesn't gel. It just doesn't seem right.
Well, and I mean, I got to be honest with you, Robert. I am torn on that universal basic income question. There are certain models. It seems like it does work to some degree, but again, you can't really base an entire philosophy around it based on a micro environment where that it might have seen some success, right? I mean, people always use the Scandinavian experiments as like Scandinavia is doing this or that, whether it's climate, something to do with climate change or whatever, and it works. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, maybe it does work there, but they also get a fair amount of subsidy from the United Nations, and it's like, who's to say that at the top end that this could work? So I guess what I'm saying is, long story short, is I do see universal basic income could work. I would say the only problem that I have against objectors of UBI is when people start saying, oh, you're just a bloody socialist, and you just want to go retire on your couch and do nothing with your life. I don't think there's anything to substantiate that claim. I think that people, when they do get certain minimums, generally people pursue their goals and their desires, and they make more of themselves.
Yeah.
Most of the time, and this has even been substantiated with giving homeless people like $7,000. There's been several projects like that where the results are very encouraging.
Yeah.
But again,
and I think we have to be.
Oh, go ahead.
Something
Go ahead.
works. Yeah, I mean, if something works, if it works and the data is positive, go for it. We can't be dogmatic about it. You know what I mean? And one of the things I do like about UBI is it tends to improve people's decision-making process. So if you have certain basic necessities covered, people tend to make better life decisions. And that's good for all of us.
Well, sure.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not saying UBI couldn't work, and maybe it is a solution. But the UBI could also fit into this idea of modern monetary theory also.
I think I have to table that question with the something from nothing cosmological question. It's just a little bit above my pay grade. But there was something else. Oh yeah, what you were mentioning about how money is stored work. I think that's how you mentioned it. And you were saying, hey, like there's gold in the hills, let's go out and dig that up. And it kind of substantiates your larger claim there that money comes from pure debt, because you're probably familiar, if you're a fan of Alan Watts, you're familiar with that story where there was there was some community, they pooled all of their wealth or gold, and they buried it, and they said, okay, this, everybody has equal properties of this, and they counted it, and they come back a few years later and found that it had been stolen from people outside of the community, I guess. And so it's like, what do we do about this? The accountants were like, it's all good. All the numbers are they make sense. So we don't need the gold anymore. And it's like, yeah, how absurd, but that's kind of the situation we find ourselves in, isn't it?
That's exactly it. It's exactly it. It's like we've lost the gold in a sense, but it doesn't matter because the story is more important than the reality. But remember, if people ever stop believing that story, if there's a doubt in that story, this is the danger of modern money. And it's a very important thing to remember. We all money is future work. Every time you get, let's say, the United States, a dollar bill, that is a promise of somebody to do something in the future. Gold is work that's already done. The work has been finished. Now, think about modern economies. Imagine I'm a fisherman in Russia, and I'm going to sell my container load of frozen fish in Busan. I'm going to sell it in dollars. But if I'm not sure about the future value of that fish I'm going to get, what I'm going to do is I'm just not going to fish, and I'm going to wait. Farmers are going to do the same thing. Factories are going to do the same thing. Then, until we have a new valid money story, we could have a problem. So people need to remember that that story is only as good as its value is in the belief in it. But if that belief wavers, it could be catastrophic. So we have to be careful with that, because then all of a sudden everything becomes real. I don't want gold, I want food.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, and this is the direction our materialist paradigm is taking us in, right? Is there's that old quote that only until all the seas are empty of fish, and that old expression, we'll finally realize we can't eat money. Uh, and that is where materialism is kind of leading us if we're not skeptical towards what it fundamentally is, eh? So yeah, I like that part of your film. It was interesting. Um, Now, moving away from money, you had mentioned Ray Kurzweil earlier, and I had watched his documentary. I think it was about a decade ago, on the singularity. Was that where that clip was from, or was that something else of him?
Yeah, it's basically, but it's the same story of his.
Right. And
He's
so,
told it many places.
yeah, he has. And he is an interesting guy. I think he is intelligent. But what are some of his predictions about the fate of the human organism, concerning AI,
Right.
I
So
guess I should say?
yeah, his basic idea is that once the operating system of computers surpasses human intelligence, at that point, it will begin to optimize itself. It'll be a self-optimizing machine. That point, and this is very important to understand in singularity theory, and this is why the singularity is so mythological. And you have to think about this carefully. Beyond that point, we cannot imagine. We cannot imagine. We cannot imagine the math, the physics, the possibilities, because it's beyond our human capacity. What goes beyond that is just a blank slate. What will happen? And for example, Kurzweil is obsessed with this idea of gene therapy. So, why do people get old? Because their genes mutate. And so you get all these mutations, and finally you just get so many problems that you die, unless you die from something else.
Right.
But what he says is, yeah, but imagine an AI system that can do CRISPR on all the genes in your body, repair them, and then all of a sudden you would be 80, and as you got older, you get younger. Because as your cells reproduce, it would be without the mutation. So all of a sudden your vision would get better, your skin would get tighter, my hair would get long and curly again. So that's part of their mythology, is and you can find this, that people of 20 years old will never die. 20-year-olds today will never die, because I think he says we reached the singularity was 2040 or something like this.
Yeah, that was crazy. This is starting to come back to me now. It's, as I say, it's been about a decade since I watched The Singularity, and I do remember that now. Yeah, he felt that, well, we're almost on the cusp of this, where we have little I can't remember what he called them, but they're like little microscopic chips that go through your blood cells and regulate everything. And it's like, well, yeah, what's the difference between that and being a computer on some level, hey? It's yeah, it's pretty spooky.
And did you see that video from Musk a couple of years ago about Neuralink? When they launched Neuralink, they made a video, they launched it, and it just showed what Neuralink was doing.
No,
And
I don't think I
I
watched that.
watched that. I was absolutely, I couldn't believe it, because I thought Neuralink was just some crazy, one of his crazy ideas. But they actually want to create machines where, you can look at your phone and say, call Susie. The phone will call Susie. Just you look at it,
Wow.
because it's going to touch that part of your brain where you think Susie, and then you can just say, call Susie. Or imagine your phone rings and you say, pick it up or hang it up. You could just do that with your mind. So some of the stuff that Neuralink is doing, I'm just like, whoa.
Yeah. Yeah, like I understood what Neuralink was, but I haven't looked much into it. That's interesting. You would you happen to have the link for that? I might just put that in the description if people are interested in it.
Yeah,
Do you,
I
yeah,
can, when we finish, I can find it for you, because
yeah,
it's
if you can.
shocking.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting. And there was something else there that I wanted to mention, and I forgot it. Right. Okay. So
Simulation.
it was more back towards Kurzweil. Uh, so he says that death is a scourge. He says he hates what death does. And I mean, there's no denying that it is uh, it's a very grievous thing. No one can say, hey, I like death. But at the same time, the necessity of death, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that all conscious systems need to come to an end? Are you a proponent of immortality, some of the techno utopian visions of that, or what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, from a philosophical standpoint, I would come from sort of the non-dual Vedantic idea that there is one unified consciousness. So all death does. So I mean, what happens in the body is it's a way for it's how can I say it's the machine through which I perceive. I, in the sense of consciousness, perceives, it sees, and interacts with itself. So the death of this is, and I don't really, I've never, it's not something that seems very relevant. It's like an old car that you just trash. Well, I mean, the car's done, but the guy driving the car would be consciousness. The consciousness remains, the car changes. Or maybe you don't need a car. But to look at nature and say, well, there's some fundamental difference between our consciousness and the consciousness of, say, a rabbit.
Yeah.
Is there really? Or a cat? I don't know necessarily. We have a mind that processes things, but our fundamental consciousness, that field of consciousness, is there any difference? So if we say, all of a sudden we start to say humans shouldn't die, then what's the next step? Well, dogs shouldn't die, right?
Yeah.
Then cats, or cats and dogs, depending on which your preference is. And it's kind of absurd. I mean, it's this play, it's this cosmic game.
It is.
And if you can step out of it and just see it as a game, because if you talk to people who've had very, very powerful transcendent spiritual experiences, death is kind of like, so it's not sort of the overarching fear that it is for many people who are materialists. But if you're a materialist, death it's a tough one to swallow. It's like, damn, I'm so smart, I've got it all figured out, I just don't want to die.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean. Well, and it's funny because we kind of led ourselves into veganism earlier, and this touches in on that. If we become, if we grant that, okay, the human experience should go on eternally, and then we think, well, that creaturely flourishing should extend to other higher organisms. And then, of course, there's no bottom to that. You start saying, well, the vegetation and anything biological. And that's kind of the thing that I struggled with vegan mentality, is like there's no doubt that I'm sympathetic towards especially
Yeah.
the industrial scale of factory farming and all of the environmental fallout associated with that, and just the pure suffering that we create in the world by doing that. All of that can be perhaps eliminated and definitely ameliorated. But my problem with veganism is, show me an instance in nature where existence itself is not dependent on feeding. Everything feeds. And so, even animals even vegetation feels pain. We can see that when a tree dies, the other trees around it will wilt. We've seen this time and again. We see how they respond to the loving green thumb. Talking to plants is beneficial to them. So how far down do you go with that, right? So I don't know how I got off on this tangent, but maybe you have some thoughts on that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to look at the vegan movement. I think it's one of the most interesting movements there is.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
Because there's an intersection of veganism and social justice. You see it. Because there is injustice from a particular perspective. There is injustice in the
Undeniably.
world. Absolutely. No one would deny it. But when you take it to an extreme, like you said, what happens is, and this is where it gets mind twisting. On one hand, is veganism part of our evolution as humans? So is it part of human evolution? This meme, is this meme part of our evolution that's pointing us in a direction that makes our civilization more sustainable, for example, which is one fascinating part of it. But the other thing is part of it is vegans, they make one philosophical mistake, is they remove themselves from nature.
Exactly.
Like, I'm not part of nature.
Yeah.
I'm something else. And then you say, wait, it's almost like a religious idea. What are you? If you ask a vegan, well, what are you? I think they would have a tendency to, if you really pushed them, probably to go to certain Eastern ideas about what they are as one unified. And if we're one unified common consciousness, how can we do this to each other? Something like that. There it would make philosophical sense. But if not, are you part of nature? So, like, if a bear comes and eats you and feeds it to its cubs, is that okay? Or is that
suppose so,
wrong? And when does it become wrong? And because the bear is not conscious, well, the bear doesn't doesn't analyze what it does and judge it. It just does it. We analyze post facto what we do, but does that really make us more moral, or does it just add a layer to our process of decision making?
Yeah.
Is that what morality is? Just that extra layer?
Well, yeah, I think you're definitely closer to the mark on that. Morality, again, is one of those intractable things that I don't think anyone has truly explained. Evolution has problems with it. The Platonic view that morality is out there. It exists in itself. That has problems with it too, right? But what you bring up there, that humans are embedded within nature, and so it's important to ask these questions. How can we reduce suffering that we're putting into the world? Those are all great questions, but at the height of philosophical inquiry, where you have moral relativism, you don't have a ground for morality. It's true that you can't say the vegan or the Christian or anybody else is any more ethical than the next, and so I think
really
there's a lot of overlap between our views on morality there. Yeah.
And I think there's a fundamental connection between social activism,
Yeah.
social justice, veganism, and the decline of Christianity, specifically Christianity in the West. Because it's all, I mean, generation on a generational basis, you see the rapid decline, especially in more, say, cosmopolitan sort of atmospheres, environments. So, just incredible decline in any sort of religious. But this need for meaning, and the need for meaning is coming in something like veganism. Because you talk to young vegans, I talk to them, and they're really passionate, and they really, they're educated, passionate, they're informed, and they'll tell you, what we're doing is wrong. And how can you argue? How can you argue with a kid who looks at one of those documentaries on a factory? I think anybody watches that and they're like, "Good God, no, this is just horrendous."
Oh,
So
no
that
doubt.
sense of meaning, it's important in veganism. I think we should respect them and understand where they're coming from. It's a very interesting place. And we were talking about a mythology. I'm convinced that veganism will become part of that new global mythology. I'm convinced of it.
Yeah.
It's going to be one of the elements in it.
Yeah. I'm certainly not opposed to vegans entering into the conversation. That's for sure. They have a lot of very valid objections to the way we're doing things, and factory farming is just the amount of suffering that is created, and supererogatory environmental degradation as well associated with industrial factory farming is terrifying. So it's as I'm with you on that. Let's allow this into the place, like into the public arena. Like Peter Singer has been a very good mind on advancing veganism. I'm kind of more with you that I think it becomes a bit of a religion at a certain point, but it's very valuable. But anyway, sorry, you got so many interesting things here. I'm going off onto so many different ideas here, but this is great.
No, sure.
Oh, okay. So I remember where I was. You played a clip, you played many clips of Joseph Campbell. That was really nice in your documentary. It was really interesting with reference to our experience and passage of time. Can you explain the difference between, and there were two concepts you brought up, the eternal now, which is an irreducible fact of consciousness, and some of the more religious ideas of heaven in the idea of being everlasting. So we're contrasting the eternal now with everlasting being. There is a difference there that he lays out. You want to just detail that?
And I follow it by a clip from Rupert Spira that I put to some music and some sparrows, where he talks about the exact same thing. So he hits it. He does a brilliant job.
He does.
I think you're quite a bit younger than I am, but in the late 80s, that when Campbell was dying, he did a very famous interview with Bill Moyers. You probably don't remember it. I think it was 8 hours on public. You're in Canada, but I think sometimes you guys watch PBS, American Public Television.
Yep.
So he did this interview with Bill Moyers, Bill Moyers, remember, just for the younger viewers, was the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson. So when you see when Lyndon Johnson gets off the plane from Dallas, when he was made president, you'll see a very young Bill Moyers running up and shaking hands with Lyndon Johnson. He was his press secretary, so in Texas. Very interesting journalist. He found Campbell at the end of his life. Campbell was dying of cancer, and I was about 20. And I watched this very famous interview. It was 8 hours they talked. And in this one section of that documentary, I think it was 6 or 8 hours. I think it was 8.
That's nuts. I could be
mistaken. Campbell's trying to talk about time, what time is. And time is how we experience the material world.
Right.
It's our experience. But time blocks out the infinite. There is no infinite in time. But what is infinite is this moment, this now in which we exist. It has no qualities. There are no qualities to now. And this is something that must drive scientists insane, because you can count time, but you can't count now. You know,
Yeah.
you can measure space, but you can't measure here. You know, measure here and now. God, if you're a physicist, you must be like, oh, don't bring that up. And so Campbell said something that bugged me. I never understood it. And I didn't really understood it until I got into reading the Upanishads. And then when you read the Upanishads, then they focus on this. That what is God? He says something interesting. It's a condescension of the infinite consciousness to the mind of man. And that's what we see as God. But if you look at that condescension of, say, universalness through the mind of man, we experience it as time in thoughts and space in the physical world. So in the physical world, it becomes space, and through our mind in thoughts, it becomes time. And that's why we have this world of space and time. But these are abstractions that we create to interpret this universal consciousness. It's a very powerful idea, but that's what he's saying. And in there, he talks about the difference between, he tells, Moyers is a Christian, like a Texas Christian. He's got that Texas drawl, and he says, so Campbell's talking to him as a Christian, and he says, heaven is everlasting. It lasts a really long time. Like, I even remember as a kid in the Mass, they would say, forever and ever, amen. But forever and ever is a long, long time. It's still in time.
But
the infinite is beyond time. And that's why many Christians miss, is they don't understand the cross. What does the cross signify? The vertical line is the infinite beyond time, and the sun, right? And then the horizontal line is the moon, what's born and what dies again. Like the crescent moon is the bull that's sacrificed. That is the horizontal. And so we experience the infinite in this horizontal field of time and space. And that's the world that we see. But remember, that world is created in our minds. But what is actually out there? What is under all of those fields?
Yeah.
Then you get into being and awareness and all this kind of stuff. I don't know if I did a good job explaining.
You did a very good job of that.
It's a difficult concept.
No, that was very well articulated. I think it's becoming much more accessible, I guess, this concept of time being an objection of conscious experience. But I worded that wrong. I said objection. I meant to say an object of it. You know what I mean? Like a case of study. You know what I mean?
It's
objectified. That's the word. That's the word that just escaped my view. Anyway, objectification of conscious experience. But I kind of analogy. It's not analogy, but a funny experience of how this relationship of time is also spatial. I learned this before I ever got into philosophy. And it was so funny how it struck me, because I was driving along. I was new to Victoria, BC here. And there's a street. It's called Herein. And I was just thinking to myself, that's a funny name. You're never Herein. You're always here. I was thinking to myself, it's a funny little pun. And then I got thinking about that as I was driving along. I was like, that's just like the objectification of time, that, we are, time is a concept within conscious experience, and same with space. You're always here. You're never there. You're always there word, and you're never here word. And so I don't know. I find that, even though it's so blazingly simple, it's also profound on some level. Hey. And so this is why and this is why we arrive at consciousness being fundamental. I don't think you necessarily have to become a metaphysical idealist necessarily, but you do. We're all we're all condemned to starting with our own conscious experience, whether you think that comes from a material substrate or whether it comes from within mind at large. We're all sort of condemned to that as a starting point, aren't we?
Absolutely. And I think some could be a very strict materialist and comfortable in this conversation. A true materialist would say, yes, that's what time is. It's the objectification of our consciousness into, segments for us to interpret this world. Because a true materialist, what underlies it all? Some particle, I guess. There must be some fundamental particle somewhere.
Yeah.
I think if you really push them, is it a particle or a field? And then where are we? It's the true materialist almost winds up very, 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 very close to the idealist if you really push them,
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Well, and the scientific view, I mean, I know how disorienting it is when you look into metaphysical idealism and say, oh, so basically this is all entirely unfalsifiable. And it's like, yeah, it's unfalsifiable by definition. And science doesn't know how to deal with that because science is in the business of objectifying nature, its behaviors. And these are questions which are not fundamentally scientific, they're epistemic of what reality it essentially is. And so do you find it still troubles you on some level to know that, yeah, okay, idealism is um, it's kind of unescapable and it's unfalsifiable. We can't prove it by definition. Does it ever give you problems that way, that we have to kind of abandon the scientific view? I know you are a proponent of science. I'm not saying that. Do you kind of understand what I'm asking though?
Oh, no, absolutely. Absolutely. If you in the film, I'm very careful to say that science does a fabulous job of predicting what will proceed. I don't say what will occur.
Right.
And the only thing that I can know is my consciousness, my conscious awareness, my percept, and I even like more saying being. I know. And I'm comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with that. And I think if a person has a certain spiritual path, it glimpses here and a glimpse there, and you can feel comfortable with the fact that my being is enough.
Yeah.
You ask yourself the question, am I aware? And yes, I am. That's enough. I think when you push enough, that's good enough for me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's encouraging, right?
I think that's, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's encouraging in the sense where that's really all you need.
I'm so sorry here, Robert. Our connection is getting really, really bad. I'm going to end the recording and call you back, okay?
Okay.
Okay, guys. So it looks like we had a couple little technical difficulties here, but we got the man on the line again. I think where we had left off, Robert, was you had mentioned in there, well, we were talking so much about consciousness, right? And everything that you were explaining is basically the where the law of attraction nets out at. We all start with our own experience. That is bottom. That's the bottom line. And you had mentioned in line with that towards the end of the video, you said, we are responsible for what we believe. Now, to most people, beliefs seem like they come down to us. We don't have much control over them. Like, what can a guy raised in Afghanistan or Iraq or Iran control about their beliefs when the proclivity statistically leads you to Islam, say? How do we have a responsibility for our own beliefs?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think in a certain arc of life we don't really we can't consume. But I think once a person is mature, what we can say is the quality of a person's life. A large part of that depends on the questions we ask.
Yeah.
And if we ask the difficult questions, eventually we're going to have to confront our beliefs. And there's two possibilities. One is don't do it. So if our experience begins to rub up against a belief, just avoid the question or disengage from the belief. And a lot of people have difficulty disengaging from those beliefs. I give the example to my students about this is do you want to believe the same things that you do when you're 15, when you're 25, when you're 35, when you're 45? Because if you do, I mean, what have you gained in life? And a lot of my students, all of my students are, followers of Islam, basically.
Yeah.
Some of them more than others. A lot of them say, well, teacher, should I question my religious beliefs? And I say, no, because I don't want to go there in a class now. So I say, no, I don't mean it that way. I mean it just normal beliefs. I give them the example of American exceptionalism. My generation, Generation X, we had this idea of American exceptionalism from our parents. And that's a belief that was very strong in Americans. Now, at some point, especially if you've traveled and you've seen the world and stuff, you realize, well, this is not a rational belief. One, it's not based in facts. And two, it's not really serving me well. So I had to get rid of that because it's nice to think you're special.
Yeah, yeah,
nice
isn't it?
I was born in the United States. So I'm special. So that's a belief I had to jettison, and it took time. You think it would be very easy, but it's difficult. We have many of those. So as we encounter them, and like I say, those two boxes, irrational, not serving me, you got to get rid of it because you're just carrying bricks.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Then you can approach the ones that are irrational and maybe serving you to a certain extent. But are they really bringing you to where you want to be? So, that's where it gets a little bit difficult. The irrational ones that maybe help me a little bit,
Well, and I think that's a great answer because, it kind of links into what we were discussing at the beginning of our conversation there with Catholicism, right? How, you can have people who kind of believe in this mythology and metaphor, and maybe to some degree even take it quite literally, but they can still orient themselves within scientific fact, such as Georges Lemaitre there. And this is something that I came to understand when I was leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses, is the bulk of them were very literalist, but I found that you could reinterpret all of the beliefs in a particular way and still sustain your religious identity. And so that's a powerful thing if you're embedded inside of a cultural belief that is your relationships are contingent upon. You don't have to get rid of everybody, just so that you can maintain your belief, so that's and that's where I think the connection to the law of attraction is very powerful. I'm just thinking there's another sort of side tangent I could go on, but maybe we'll leave that there for today because we've had a little bit of technical difficulties and stuff like that. But I really do hope you come back, Robert. This has just been wonderful.
I'd love to.
So yeah, thanks for taking the time. I just wanted to mention that the links you mentioned, he had actually found it. Robert found it when we were going through the technical glitches. So I'll link that up in the description. And of course, I'll link up your channel and your wonderful documentary. Give the guy some views, subscribe to him. And is there anything else I can promote before I let you go there, Robert?
Yeah, really, that's it. I mean, all of my stuff is on my YouTube channel. And also I have a blog, The Cactus Land, which has all of the articles I've written, my books, that kind of stuff. So if you wanted to find out more about me, it's thecactusland.com. But those are the two places, basically.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll put that in the description below as well. Thank you so much, Robert, and I hope to see you again soon, okay?
Thanks a lot, Derek. Really enjoyed it.
Okay, you get some rest because it's late over there now, I think.
I got class tomorrow, so.
Okay, well, best of luck with that. Take care, buddy.
Thanks a lot, Derek. Take care. Good night. Bye-bye.
Hey guys, did you like this video? You know what to do. And if something I mentioned today resonated with you, Click one of them cards on this screen. I have lots of related content sure to interest you. Thanks as always for your views, and we'll see you next time.